Hi everyone, welcome back to the VAK podcast. I'm Utkarsh Mohan.
Namaste, Sumedha Verma Oja, historian and author.
Wonderful. So, firstly, folks, thank you for the response to the second podcast. I think, at least for me, it exceeded all my expectation. We made a little clip of it, and I think across platforms that clip has got, I think, close to 50,000 views. I know it's not a lot, but for something brand new, it is definitely heartening. So, thank you for everybody who's been tuning in. Okay, so this one is going to be on another interesting topic. I know touching on the caste system was something that interested a lot of people, but perhaps this will interest you as well. And this is the Aryan Invasion Theory. So today I'm going to be asking three questions. The first question is, over the last few years, I've been hearing that the Aryan invasion is really a myth. There has been evidence, genetic evidence, otherwise. So we're going to figure out what is the latest evidence, what is it that we know right now, and why it seems to suggest that the Aryan invasion theory is a myth. Question number two, we're going to deep dive into the term Aryan itself. What does Aryan mean? Where has it come from? How has that term been used across history and also misappropriated by certain parties? Chief amongst which you would, of course, think about the Nazi party in Germany and Hitler, of course. And since we are on that tangent, what exactly was the Aryan of the Nazis, the Aryan of Hitler? Where did that come from, and why did certain Hindu symbols like the swastika get taken, and how does it all connect together? So these are three things I'm very interested in understanding. So where do we get started?
I think let's get started with the Aryan invasion theory proper.
Yes.
Because that will, that's something which is more related to us as in Indian history. The misappropriation is an egregious, terrible thing that has happened against us. Let's deal with that right at the end. And it is, of course, interesting to a lot of people, more interesting to a non-Indian audience perhaps. But let's start with the Aryan invasion theory. It will give an idea of the many ways in which Aryan, swastika, Sanskrit were misused. So the idea in the 18th century was very different. It was not so much the Aryan invasion theory. In fact, when the colonizers came into India and they saw the rich culture and language, in the beginning they were very impressed. And there was a kind of Indomania in Europe in the 17th, 18th century. But that Indomania, wherein everything they wanted to connect it to India and think of it as originating from India, very soon changed. Because India, from exotic trade partner, place of luxuries, just became a colony. You were exploiting the colony and you didn't want to think much of the natives. So then came in, and we will trace this in great detail when we look at Hitler and Nazis and German Indologists. We will trace it in great detail, but to put it succinctly, right now, the idea was that around say 1500 BCE, which means say we are in 2000 now, so about 3500 years ago, 1500 BCE, this thundering group of warriors on their horse-driven chariots came from the steppes. From the steppes they came in hordes and invaded India and conquered it. What did India have? So India had the original Harappan civilization. We've all heard of the Harappan civilization, the Indus Valley or the Saraswati Sindhu civilization as it is called. So they thundered in on their horse-driven chariots. So Utkarsh, don't forget horse and chariot, because those are two very important things about which there have been astounding modern discoveries, astonishing multi-century surprise discoveries like Tutankhamun's tomb or something like that. So they came in with their language. Their language was Sanskrit, and their culture was the Vedic culture. They composed the Rig Veda, all the other Veds, the Upanishads and everything. Basically they took over the culture of the Indian subcontinent. They pushed the Harappans down south. So that's why you have this north-south divide. What's the idea of the Aryan invasion theory? That the north is different, full of invaders. The south is different. It is the indigenous inhabitants. So the southern languages, the so-called Dravidian languages, are the original languages of India, whereas Sanskrit and all its other linked languages, the Indo-European family of many languages in North India, all of this has been given to us by invaders. So this, in a nutshell, is the Aryan invasion theory.
Just to understand, so that's very helpful, very similar to what I understand as well. So I understand the cultural context of Indomania shifting to, hey, this is a colonized country and you don't really care much for them and you don't look at them in a good light. But what was the starting point? Was there some evidence? I'm assuming there was something that started this. It wouldn't just be the cultural whims, right? There must be some.
I will do a bit of a segue into Indology, German Indology as well as European Indology. So what was the thing that sparked it off? What sparked it off was Sanskrit.
Yes.
Sanskrit was seen to be very similar to many European languages. And in fact, there were scholars who did some work on it and who first posited that, look, Sanskrit is so similar to Latin, it seems they are sister languages. So what's the story here? How come? So this was what sparked off the whole idea of there being something which binds these two cultures together. Now what is it? Is it that Latin is the one which actually gave rise to Sanskrit? Unfortunately, they could not prove it because Sanskrit was much older than Latin. So what was the story? This is what sparked off this whole idea of the likeness in cultures, and then they started looking for answers. So what is the answer? What happened? So then they decided that of course Sanskrit cannot be indigenous. It has to be, something that the superior race, the white race, that white race actually got Sanskrit into India. And you see, it fed in very well into the colonial narrative that the English, the Europeans, the colonizers were the inheritors of those pure Aryans who had come so many thousand years ago. They had intermixed with the local population, lost their purity and become degraded. So a conquering race of Europeans, white Europeans, had come back again to lead them out of this dark native, these depths that it had fallen into. So the spark was linguistic. And then of course it became much more than linguistic. It became cultural, it became racial, it became genetic in later years. So the spark was Sanskrit.
Yes. Was there ever any archaeological evidence beyond just linguistic assumption?
So you see, whenever we look at any historical event, historiography says that you have to look for evidence. The evidence can come from, as you say, archaeology or inscriptions or numismatics or linguistics. And today we have things like, genetics and more scientific or science-based evidence sources. Mortimer Wheeler was somebody who did a lot of work with the Indus Valley civilization. In one of the places, he found the skeletons of about 36 men, women and children. One of those skulls was a little cracked on the head. That was the basis of this entire edifice. So they said, look, this is evidence that those thundering warriors who had come on their horses killed off everyone in the Indus Valley civilization. These skeletons. And look, this is the mark of somebody who has been hit and who has died due to violence. It's a very different matter that those 36 skeletons have been studied in great detail later. Most of them are said to have died of disease. But at the
time, if they died of violence, why would the assumption be the violence is coming from somewhere else?
Yeah, you have very good questions. Unfortunately, nobody asked them those questions because they were not questioned. They just put forth their theories. Some of it, Utkarsh, when you read it, it's just childish. It is crude, childish and stupid. But nobody questioned them. Racism was the order of the day. So it was kind of like understood. Like we were talking about, most of books or popular culture denigrating Hindus. In the same way, Aryan invasion theory was taken to be ab initio true. simply because everyone felt that, yeah, it's true, the whites are superior to the blacks, so they must have at one time conquered them. And since they admired some aspects of Hindu culture, they wanted to take possession of it and take ownership of it. So this was the great idea of the subjugation. So there were articles like Indra stands accused. So Indra is the archetypal Aryan of the Rig Veda who has killed off all the native inhabitants. So you had very low on fact and high on opinion kind of articles, even academic articles like that.
Okay. And I think there was an entire field of study, I think in the 19th century, which has since been proven to be pseudoscience, right? Like, what's it called? Eugenics or something, where they were...
Yeah. Eugenics, and you took the measurement of the skull,
Yes,
and you decided on the basis of the skull. So all these are, that's why anthropology has such a bad name, because it started off as basically trying to prove races, and races are extremely difficult to prove. For the Aryan invasion theory, if we look at the different kinds of evidences that there are, you talked about the archaeological one. Then the archaeological evidence very soon began to fail. So it was so gaping that even the most committed person felt that no, we need some other evidence. They had, as a kind of backup, they had evidence from the Rig Veda, linguistic evidence. As it happened, linguistic evidence and evidence from the Rig Veda has also failed, but that is why they have had to shift to genetics, which we'll study. But I'll tell you something about the Rig Veda. So the idea of the Aryan invasion theorists was that the Rig Veda was composed by these thundering warriors, and then there are things internal to the Rig Veda which prove this theory of white versus black, and these inferior races versus superior races. So in one place in the entire Vedic literature, I kid you not, one place, a word has been used which is called a nas. A nas is nasika, or nose, means without a nose. So that has been turned into without a nose, therefore snub nose, therefore not an aquiline feature, therefore not an Aryan, therefore a Dravidian, therefore a local native kind of race which was subjugated by the Aryan. So on this one word, reams have been written. Then you have later another very important event in the Rig Veda, which is called the Battle of the 10 Kings, Dash Raj Yuddha. So in this Dash Raj Yuddha, there are two sides, and one of them wins, and that is the one which takes on the culture of Bharat and of the Rig Veda forward. So what was the idea of these people who described the fight? That it was the whites fighting the blacks. Now why did they say that it was whites fighting the blacks? So they use the word askini. So askini, one of the dhatus, does mean black. But what is the askini? It is the name of the river Chenab. So it is describing a geographical area. It is not describing black-skinned people. Then say for the people who were white-skinned, Vashisht, he was a Purohit. So in the Rig Veda it is said that he is white-clad, which means he wears a white uttariya and antariya. What is the translation? White-skinned.
That's white clothes.
So you see this kind, yeah, very close, but very different. So you see, these kind of things were picked up in this very ridiculous kind of way, and if they were challenged, nobody took it seriously, because there's another thing, Utkarsh, which I am noticing from our last two podcasts, the kind of people who are critiquing us. The critiques are very strange. What they say is, no, the British could not have done anything wrong. You must be wrong. You are trying to glorify the past and you are telling lies. Whatever the British said was correct. So this is somehow a psychological feature, that whatever someone else from outside says is correct. And if we try to, set the record straight, there is a trust deficit. We are trying to cover that trust deficit and hopefully putting forward evidence, etc. But this is something that operated in a much stronger way at the time. So you could get away, you still can, but to a lesser extent, you could really literally get away with murder.
Yeah. So speaking of evidence, so this for me, so what do we know today, right? So over the last few years, so I understood the original Aryan Invasion Theory, which is very, and somehow I don't know, somehow it's also crept through popular culture, right? Even in my group of friends, it's this thing you joke about. It may seem harmless, but really it's kind of propagating an outdated view based on some very dubious evidence based on what you're saying. So what is it that we know? I understand that archaeology and history in general is an evolving subject, right? You can never be perfectly certain. But what is it that we do know right now, and what is that evidence that tells us what this latest view?
Okay, so one thing that was clear is that this Aryan invasion theory did not have the evidence to bolster it. So after some time, it was tried to be watered down. That they did not thunder down on their horses and chariots. They kind of crept in very sweetly. They migrated like very ideal immigrants. So it became the Aryan immigration or Aryan migration theory.
What is the timeline on this? When this?
Yeah, so the timeline remains the same. 1500.
No, as in the theory, evolution of the theory. So when till when?
So the evolution, say about, I would say around 40 years ago, 30-40 years ago, there was this very strong pushback. Because, there are not always people who are biased. There are also people who want to know the truth, like you and me. So they looked at this stuff and said, no, it's not happening. There's no evidence. So then there was a change in the way it was approached. So invasion removed because there was no evidence of invasion. Migration or immigration put in. That too, they came in trickles and somehow took over a fully functional and very, very sophisticated civilization, which in itself is a very ridiculous statement. But anyway, I just want to tell you a small thing that although in the history of this theory, it has come up in the last 30-40 years that it's called the AMT or the Aryan Migration Theory, one of the most vocal proponents was our Mr. Hitler. When he talked of Aryans coming into the different countries, he did not say Aryan invasion. He said Aryan immigration. So I think the German word is Einwanderer or something. He used that word. So it has very, very fishy and very, very terrible antecedents. Even this Aryan migration theory has very, very fishy antecedents. So the Aryan migration theory then started depending on a couple of things. Archaeology, sorry, it was a waste. They couldn't get anything from there. The second thing that they wanted was, they looked at was linguistics. So therefore, torturing of evidence, linguistic evidence, and torturing of genetic evidence. So let's take linguistic evidence first. They had already understood that there was a kind of link between many European languages and many Indian languages. So how was this link to be understood? Parallel to the Aryan invasion or migration theory was this linguistic theory of how Sanskrit developed, how Proto-Indo-European developed, and how it came into India. So as the Aryans originated either in the steppes, the Russian steppes, that is the steppe theory, and there is the second theory is called the Anatolian theory, that is the Anatolian farmers. That's from where the Aryans developed. So these two are the origin points. So similarly for linguistics, they decided that this is from where Proto-Indo-European actually started. What is Proto-Indo-European? This is a hypothetical mother language of Sanskrit. So having found in terms of evidence that there is no language older than Sanskrit, this hypothetical language was conjured up out of theoretical thin air to say that this was the antecedent of Sanskrit, and this actually developed somewhere in the steppes. Then from there started this whole torturing of evidence and of all the different languages spoken in this area, spoken in between, when you come from the steppes towards India. That kind of torture started. There's one thing which I have just realized, although it's, I'm jumping back, but I think we must, when we talk of the Aryan invasion theory, we must talk about Aryans also. And since we are on the topic of linguistics, it's a good time to talk about the meaning of the word Aryan. What is the Sanskrit meaning of the word Aryan? So it just means somebody who is cultured. It's not a race. It's if you are a cultured and educated person, you are called Arya. And therefore, Aryan is not a race marker. It is mostly used as a sambodhan, that is Mr. Utkarsh. So if this had been 2000 years ago, I would have called you Arya Utkarsh. That's all it is. And this has been turned into a race. This has been turned into so many other things, whereas it's just a word of addressing someone, and it's also a marker of a person who is accomplished and who is educated. So this is how linguistics, languages and meanings are also tortured. So we were talking about how they made up this language called PIE, which does not exist, but it is supposed to be the mother language of Sanskrit. It's a very crazy language because you cannot really use this language or understand it as a real language, but it has been posited. Now, I agree that languages must have evolved. So, before Sanskrit, there must have been something. Some Proto-Sanskrit would definitely have been there. However, this PIE is not it. And PIE has been made in such a way so as to coalesce parallelly very neatly with the Aryan Invasion Theory, with the idea that since people came from the steppes, since they came from Anatolia, so must languages have come from there. And in their understanding then, Sanskrit evolved around say 1500, 1800 BCE in India. But there are some earlier inscriptions in Sanskrit. They are the famous Mitanni inscriptions, and coincidentally again it is a horse trader who is writing about horse training. The problem is that all these timelines do not really fit in with each other. They have to be tortured. Another source of evidence is archaeoastronomy. Archaeoastronomy dates texts by looking at the astronomical events described in them and then going back and seeing when these astronomical events actually took place. So if you try to see some of these astronomical events and see what the age of the Rig Veda is, you don't arrive at the same answers as what these linguistic and what these Aryan migration theorists are trying to say. In this context, I want to now bring in some people who have been doing very good work. There is a Mr. Shrikant Talageri. He has worked on the Rig Veda, on the chronology of the 10 different books of the Rig Veda, and when and who would have written it, etc., in a very, very exemplary and evidence-filled way. Then you have a very famous social scientist, historian called Kinrad Elst. He has also worked on this. And together, if I put these two things together and tell you something about the problems with the linguistic dating, there are books 1 to 10 and some miscellaneous parts of the Rig Veda. However, books 1 to 10 are not chronologically in order of time. So it was not as if 1 was written, then 2, then 3, then 4. In fact, the 10th book is the last book. And if anyone, it's a very, very technical subject. If you want to read about this, I suggest Shrikant Talageri's blogspot, which is very much on the internet. And if at the end we have some time, I will give you a very fascinating hypothesis put forward by Sanjeev Sanyal using all these. And I'm going to put together Sanjeev Sanyal's views and Shrikant Talageri's evidence and tell you some very interesting things about this land of ours. However, to continue with this, if we look at the astronomical events which are mentioned in the Rig Veda themselves, I will tell you the exact date to which it can be put. So, if you look at the 10th book, which is the last book chronologically speaking, it can be dated to 2300 BCE. So 2300 BCE is not the same date as mentioned by the Aryan invasion or migration theorists. They wanted to be composed around 1500 BCE. And this is archaeoastronomy, that is astronomical events. And this is the 10th book. Remember, the 10th book is the last. So
Last
they
book,
would have
yeah.
you would have needed time to compose the other books. So at least we can go up to 3000 BCE, maybe even more. Now another piece of evidence. There is a Vedang Jyotish. Jyotish is one of the Vedangs. It is the study of astronomy. It's not, looking at your hand and telling you when you'll get married and when you'll get a job, or whether India will win the World Cup. That's not Jyotish. Jyotish is a Vedang. And
That's just on that. I think that is another interesting, not today, but maybe in a different episode, because in popular culture, a lot of this is relegated to fun and games and funny, blind superstition and nonsense. So it'll be very interesting to know why that happened and what the origin was.
Yes, we must do one podcast on Jyotish, definitely. So the Vedang Jyotish is all about studying the stars. So naturally you can imagine that it dates itself very consciously using two events. I will not go into details of that because none of us are astronomers here, but you can read about it if you like. And they date themselves to 1300 BCE. Now 1300 BCE is dangerously close to the 1500 BCE, at which time the Rig Veda was supposed to be composed, whereas this Vedang Jyotish is one of the Angas of the Rig Veda that was composed thousands of years after the Rig Veda. So if a later composition...
How do we know that this was composed thousands of years after?
Yeah, because there is something called the Chaturdash Vidyasthanam of Indic epistemology, which gives you the whole range of knowledge, where it was contained and how it was composed and which were the companion books. So it was first the 3 Vedas, the 4 Vedas which were composed, and then their companion books. And the Vedang was composed after the Ved, so that you would be able to understand the Ved.
And the gap was 1,000 years. What?
No, that is an assumption. That is an assumption which is based on a study of Vedic and Upanishadic literature and the understanding of how much time would have passed. There is nothing hard and fast about this 1,000 years. It's just my off-the-cuff remark. But a good period of time would have to be there between the Rig Veda and its companion books or its explicatory Angas, of which one is Vedanga. So, if one of the later Vedangs was composed 1300 BCE, then how can you have the Rig Veda itself composed in 1500 BC? You can't. And by the way, I must say, what was the beginning of this whole thing? The beginning as ever is found in the Bible, in the Word. So all this comes from Genesis. What did Genesis say? That everyone was together and then people spread out and started speaking different languages, etc., etc. So it is from the book of Genesis that this whole idea of one group of people spreading out, speaking different languages, that is from where it comes. And our dear friend Max Mueller, one of those dead white men who has done a lot of harm to us, he dated the Rig Veda to 1500 BC because he took the date of the creation of the world by God as 4102 BC. So that is according to the Bible.
That is by adding up the lifetimes of everybody in the Bible, right? I remember something like that. Am I mistaken?
I don't know how they have actually come to that 4102 BC. Maybe we'll have to find out and say and explain. Yeah. But that is the date, because the date and time of the creation of the world is very clear, I believe, in Christian theology. So that was the time the world was created according to Christians, and then Max Mueller believed it. So then he did a few pluses and minuses and he arrived at 1500 BC. At the end of his life, he apologized for this, by the way, and said that it is arrant nonsense. But by that time, people had picked it up and no one was going to give it up at all. So we were at archaeoastronomy. That is one of the pieces of evidence from which can be seen that this very nice logical system which the Aryan Migration Theory wants to build up, that even if archaeology is not okay, see, this is the linguistic evidence. Now, on these issues, a lot of work is being done today. It's not as if people have stopped working on it. One or two things are significant, which I will mention here. One is that if you cast your eyes back to the past in our country, there's a puzzle. There is a huge amount of archaeological remains of the Sindhu Saraswati civilization, earlier known as the Indus Valley civilization. But we have not deciphered their script text. We don't know what it means as yet. No fully accepted decipherment is there. Then you have this huge corpus of compositions, the Vedic compositions and Upanishadic compositions, which are hanging in the air, so to speak. Where was the civilization and culture which actually produced it physically? Where was it? We don't have any clue. We keep guessing.
And these were oral as well, right? These were
oral. Yes, the Vedic compositions were oral, so they could have been. You cannot rely on actual written documents for this because these were oral. So you
given
have
the timelines, doesn't it kind of match?
That's what we think. That's what a lot of people think, and that's what a lot of people are trying to do.
But we cannot. We cannot be sure for some reason.
Yes, but what we cannot be sure because enough research has not been done. The Sindhu Saraswati civilization and the people who composed the Vedas, were they the same? What are the arguments for this? What are the arguments against it? We already know because of the Aryan Invasion Theory. Those are the arguments against it. And the biggest one which they keep pushing is thundering down on their horses and chariots. Don't forget the horses. We'll get back to them.
I'm curious about the horses. Yes, let's get to it sometime.
And chariots.
Yes, go ahead.
Don't forget the chariots.
And chariots, both.
Yeah. So, the arguments against it we have seen in the Aryan Invasion Theory. What are the arguments for it? The arguments for it are the parallels that we can see in the things that are described in the Vedic corpus and later Upanishadic corpus, in some of the practices that are there today, and what is found in terms of physical remains. I'll give you a simple one. You can see that I am wearing sindoor. So there is a figure of a woman from Naushera around 7500 BCE. She has the same kind of hair as me and she wears sindoor in her parting. You know, when I first saw it, I mean, it struck me so immediately that this is something that I do every day. There is not much difference between that woman and me. If you just took my face and that woman's bust, there wouldn't be much of a difference. So this is the one which this is my favorite, but there are many other things. For instance, there is the worship of Shiva. There is the use of the same kind of, like the people patta, the people tree. Then there are also on the seals, there are representations of the mother goddess. Then there are also representations of yogic postures. There are also representations of the same kind of dress. The Uttarya and the Antarya of the Vedic age can be seen in the figurines of the Harappan age also. So anybody who is interested in this topic can read books by David Frawley, by Michel Denino, by B.B. Lal. These books are very much available and we'll give a list at the end. So these are the archaeological remains which fit in with whatever can be seen, with a lot of things that can be seen. And you know, Utkarsh, if we go down to it, you know, chess sets have been found in Harappa. Then the weights and measures which were used in Harappa were also used in Mauryan India. The size of the bricks has remained the same. Fire sacrifice altars, which we call Yagya Vedis in our own Sanskrit terms, have been found as Harappan remains. So the real big piece which has to slide into place is the decipherment of that script. So an Italian social scientist, linguist, has just published his thesis a couple of months ago, and I will actually also link to that thesis, where he has posited that Sanskrit should be used to understand the Harappan script. And if you use those pointers, then it will be easy for us to decipher it. There is a gentleman called S. Kalyan Raman, who is also doing a huge amount of detailed work on the links between the Harappan script and Sanskrit, and images which are used in the Harappan script and those which we can find today in our country. This is work in progress. This is
So the
something which
significance
is still
of this,
on.
yeah, so the significance of this would be, is it that we know that the Harappan people were native? They were not coming. So how would this relate to the Aryan
Yeah.
or
So-
countering the Aryan invasion or the Aryan
Yes.
migration theory?
Yes. So, as far as the Harappan people being native, whatever has been found in the archaeological remains points to local products being used, local areas being settled for thousands and thousands of years, and there is no evidence of any outside shock. There is no evidence of any
I see.
outside shock. The interesting thing, of course, is, and why these AIT theorists jumped in, is because the Saraswati Sindhu civilization died out. Why did it die out is one of the biggest historical mysteries we have. So Mortimer Wheeler said that those thundering horses on their warriors wiped out this civilization. However, there is also an area of study which is paleoclimatology, paleogeology. So today, the conclusion we are coming to is that there were some huge climate changes. Monsoons failed. There were also, the Shivaliks, the mountain ranges, the Himalayan mountain ranges shifted, and the Saraswati River dried up.
Yeah.
The Saraswati River was a lifeline of the Saraswati Sindhu civilization. I can add here in a parenthesis that it's called Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, which is now in Pakistan, because the first settlements were found there. But later, along the bed of the Saraswati, more than 2,300 settlements of the Saraswati Sindhu civilization have been found. So it is clear now that the locus, the focus, the center was not Harappa or Mohenjo-daro, but it was in around the Saraswati Sindhu civilization around Haryana. So Rakhi Gadhi is one of the newest places which has been found, which is yielding amazing evidence. Now you also asked about how do we know their original. So I must mention another gentleman here, Dr. Neeraj Rai. He is a paleogeneticist and he is doing amazing work in this area, which I will talk about a little later also. Right now what I want to mention is that he has now got access to genetic material from Kalibangan, from Lothal, and also from Burzahom. All these are very old Indus Valley or Saraswati Sindhu settlements. Certain skeletons were found. So now the genetic material from these has been made available for analysis. And he works at a lab. I was just listening to a talk of his. So he and his team are working, and maybe by this year or next year we'll get some good results. So maybe, we'll talk about it.
Is there not
come.
evidence in the genetic makeup of Indians today, like in mine,
Okay.
yours, any?
That's the big question. So should we already address it, or I think what did I?
So I think of, yeah. Go ahead. Please finish your flow.
No. I'm just gathering my thoughts. Tell me, what were you saying?
No, so I think the following things are clear, right? So the Aryan Invasion Theory has a rather colonial white-centric origin, which you took us through. Then we have the Aryan Migration Theory, which
Racist.
is
Use
involved
the word
into...
racist.
Yes, I'll use the word racist.
Yes.
Then you have the Aryan Migration Theory, which has a rather dubious origin point, Mr. Hitler, and of course, the evidence doesn't corroborate that as well. So, what I want to get into now is, and which is why I think the genetic evidence was a good part of it, is based on the scientific method or whatever is the accepted means of figuring out the best picture of history used today. What is the current accepted view? What does genetic evidence say? You mentioned the archaeological evidence at length. I'm curious now also about the genetic evidence, particularly in the makeup of Indians today.
Yes. So that's an amazing area of study which has come into prominence for the whole question of Aryan invasion or not and migration in the past, say, I would say 20-25 years. Many people have used it, because when genetics came up and paleogenetics came up, then it was obviously a good source of evidence, and our poor Aryan invasion theorists were very sad because they had not got any traction anywhere, so they jumped onto genetics. Now for this we have to know something. We have to know a few terms, just a few terms. So what is a...
I'll try my best to understand. Go ahead.
I am sure you'll understand. So what is a haplogroup? So a haplogroup is a group of people who share a common ancestor with certain specific genetic mutations. So it is like a huge extended family. Okay. And there are two types of haplogroups. One is with a Y chromosome, male ones. And the other is the mtDNA, which is the female ones, mtDNA. So we have a plethora of these. These are generally given, A, B, C, D, X, Y, Z, R kind of names. They are numerical, alphanumeric kind of codes because there are so many. What we want to know is about the R1A1A. This haplogroup is the, smashing success of genetics and mutation and succeeding across millennia. It has the most number of people today. Almost 1 billion people in the world are R1A1A.
Okay.
This R1A1A, why are we interested in it for our current topic today? Because it represents Indo-European people. And it represents that group which is being tracked to see did it come from the steppes or from Anatolia to India, or as somebody called Edwin Bryant said, is there actually an out of India solution? Is it that it is all these people who went out from here and actually spread their genes and their culture across the intervening spaces and also in Europe? Just to pause there for a second, because just to absorb. So what we are saying is, and here could you say it again, R1A1A? Is that right?
Yes,
that's right.
Okay, so R1A1A, so two things that I took away from what you said. One is, so there is a shared haplogroup between Indians and Europeans. I'm using both terms very loosely. Yes. You can probably specify what it is and probably why.
It's better to keep it loose for the moment. Yes, okay. For our understanding.
Okay. And you said it's almost 1 billion people, which seems to imply to me that it's not all of India, because India is 1.5 billion by itself. So not all Indians have this.
No.
Okay. So maybe that could be. Go ahead. I just wanted to confirm.
Yeah. So you know that in Africa is the most genetic diversity in the entire world.
Yes.
India is second. Yes. India is second in terms of genetic diversity, and diversity means origin point. The further you move away from diversity, the further you are moving away from origin point. Yeah. So the more the diversity, the greater is the origin point. Now we have two streams of thought today in terms of genetic evidence. One of them insists on that same timeline that we have seen for Aryan invasion, Anatolia, steppes. We've seen it for linguistics also. That same kind of argument. A very famous study was that of David Reich in 2018. And so all the invasionists in India were like, okay, now we got it, now we won. Because it's David Reich's theory has solved everything. That's a good question. We will just look at whether it did or not. On the other hand, are people like Neeraj Rai, and there are many others. He collaborates with a few labs in Italy, and his findings are very, very scientific. So he is not into this kind of politics about proving this theory or disproving that theory. He is just a scientist. What Neeraj Rai says is that the R1A1 parent haplogroup, because these haplogroups also give rise to other haplogroups, which is why you have R1A1 and then you can add A, B, C, lots of things.
I see. Yeah.
So R
Yeah.
will be the original haplogroup. Then another subset
So
will
on
be
and so
R1,
forth.
then
Yeah.
R1A, then R1A1. So what he says is that the oldest examples of R1A, okay, not R1A1, but R1A.
Even before that.
Even
Yeah.
before
Yeah.
that, they belong to India. They have been found in India almost 16,000 years ago. So this shoots the Aryan migration invasion theory to wits, because it shouldn't have been here. If they are Indo-Europeans, if these are Indo-European genetics, why are they in India before 1500 BCE? There is no answer to that, except an answer which says that no, the Aryan invasion theory was it was an invention.
So to me,
What
that
Neeraj
sounds
Rai-
like a smoking gun. Why is it even disputed if the earlier haplogroup is?
I'll tell you why. See, because many and most of these studies, there were earlier studies in which they proved that R1A1 originated in Europe. This was done 15 years ago. There was a study that R1A1 was originally from Europe. Now, in this database, they did not bother to include too many Indians. So not
Sample
more than
size.
50 to 100, yes, not more than 50 to 100 samples were taken from India. So that is not only that, they also took very selective samples. They are only interested in two types of samples from India. One is Brahmins and the other is tribals. They don't want to take any other samples from India. So you see, in sample selection, in sample size, there is already a lot of bias. Again, in the studies which purport to prove that exactly within that period that we are talking of 1500 and 100 years plus minus, these genes were introduced into India, some studies have been published. Not only are they kind of fly-by-night studies and published in very vague kind of publications, there are problems with sample size. Then there are problems with assumptions. So what are they assuming? They are assuming, say for example, that 29 years means one generation, and then they do their studies on the basis of this. Suppose with 29 years as one generation, they have arrived at their conclusion that this gene came into India around the time that they want. But suppose you change that to 32. The time changes completely. Change that to 30. The time period changes completely. So in all these studies, the sample sizes as well as the sample selection, the assumptions are not standing up to scrutiny. What Neeraj Rai is doing is a work in progress in many ways, because he takes modern DNA as well as ancient DNA. Remember, I told you that some of it is becoming available to him. So he takes both, and
Yep.
then he tries to understand what is the current situation of R1A1 genes here and what is the ancient situation. So the biggest hit against the Aryan invasion theory is that the R1A1 is so diverse and so widespread in India that it cannot be explained through an injection via some mild migrations in 1500 BCE. And it has existed for a very, very long time. I also want to say, what does he say? That R1A1, they have picked up the R1A1 and its phylogeny has been completely delineated. There are 50 mutations and downstream markers of where these went, these R1A1 genes. So Kerala, Karnataka, Central India, all of tribal population, the diversity of R1A1 in these populations is double that found in European populations. And remember, diversity
leads to
equals
origin
point.
Yes.
Yeah. So what does this make you think? Obviously, that if diversity is so much less amongst Europeans and it's so much more in central India, in the tribal populations of India, in fact across 30% of Indian population, then it is obvious that we have to look somewhere else that rather than the Anatolian theory or the step theory for the origin of R1A1. There's another thing which I want to tell you. There is a lot of step related ancestry in India. There is a lot of Central Asian ancestry in India today. Modern genetics. Why? And to what period can we see it? Most of it has come in around the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. The earliest few little bits that you can find are in the 2nd or the 3rd century before the Common Era, but the whole big chunk dates from the 1st through the 2nd century AD. Now, if we look at our history as we see it, that was the time after the collapse of the Mauryans, after the collapse of the Sungas and the Satkarnis, there was a huge influx from Central Asia. You had a huge Kushan Empire. And the Kushans are a very, very ideal Indian dynasty. They came in, they completely integrated with local customs. They were some of the biggest Shaivites and Buddhists that you will find across history. We have beautiful compositions, religious compositions, and they were a very ideal kind of.
But where was the capital of the Kushan Empire? Was it in China or India?
No, it was in India.
Oh.
And most of the remains have been found in India.
Okay, so it's an Indian empire which, okay, maybe this is all semantics, I don't know. But so was it it's a bit of a...
No, it is semantics because...
Yeah,
it is semantics because you cannot say that it's an Indian who went and brought in that part of China because it was the other way around.
Okay. So that's important.
But they chose to base themselves, in northern India.
Interesting.
And we have so many inscriptions and so many compositions and so much cultural material from them. However, we can do another podcast on the Kushans.
We'll swivel back to the original topic. Yes.
Yeah. The point here was that we can see from what we know of our history that around the 2nd, 3rd century BCE also, remember the Mauryans came into contact with the Greeks.
Yes.
And they came into contact with the Seleucids. And there was a huge amount of coming and going. Megasthenes, for example, who wrote the Indica. So there was a huge amount of coming and going. There were Greek settlements in Gujarat. So it's not surprising that you find the R1A1 or the step ancestry marker, not the R1A1, the step ancestry marker. It's not surprising that you find it because there were a lot of people who came in from Europe at the time and from Central Asia. So this is all that is coming up in the new work which is being done by Dr. Neeraj Rai. What some people are saying is that we should go to the parent haplogroup of R1A1, which is called R1B, and see what was the ancestry, what were the markers of R1B. So perhaps in the future we'll be able to see a bit of that.
That work has not been done yet?
So currently then, it's being done.
It's being done right now.
Expect the results in 1 year or 2 years.
Okay.
And Dr. Neeraj Rai has not disappointed us. It is his definitive study which proves that R1A1 originates in India. We can link to that study also. And he is working hard on many other aspects which will throw into relief a lot of things about ancient India, which will challenge a lot of assumptions of people who have, been just carried along the mainstream thinking of either Aryan invasion or giving the credit for everything that happened in India to people who came from outside India. So, Utkarsh, I want to point out that the reason why the Europeans and the English and today's Marxists latch on to this Aryan invasion theory is because they want to prove that there was nothing indigenous. This land did not have any self-aware idea of itself as a unity. It is only a geographical space where people from outside have come and left their imprint. That is the political thinking, that is the vested interest behind the Aryan invasion theory. It is, the kind of people say there was no India, there were just a few states littered around the railway tracks that the British made. That kind of idea. So the whole controversy between Bharat and India, did Bharat exist? So the invasion theory is just to put in relief the fact that this geographical space has had no indigenous people. It is only either the Aryans, whatever you want to call them, later the Mughals, later the English, and you can imagine that the colonialists latched onto this theory very happily. It kind of fed into their own idea. So this is a way of chipping away at the national consciousness or the Rashtra consciousness of Indians. So it's very popular with the Marxists who don't want to believe in the nation anyway.
Yeah, that's very informed. So just to ask a pointed question, right? So I think I understood everything that you said. Is there, and maybe we don't even have an answer for this question, because the terms themselves are very loose terms. Is there any sort of marked genetic difference between North Indians and South Indians based on the data?
No,
Exactly.
not at all. I should have said that.
Yes, that is what everyone would want to know. So the answer is no.
Absolutely none.
No, exactly.
There is a very strong answer to this. You must read Neeraj Rai's works. There is no genetic difference between people of North India, South India, East India, West India. We are an amalgam. And sorry, I should have led with this, because this is another one of those very big hits against the Aryan invasion theory.
Yes.
There is absolutely no difference. So what all this racist stuff says that North Indians are invaders is, well, it's all made up.
You were mentioning earlier that there was not a unified theory, but there was some theory that you wanted to go through in terms of explaining. I think you mentioned Sanjeev Sanyal and a few other folks.
No, but before that,
Okay.
do we want to look at Hitler?
Yes, of course. Let's do that. So take me through the journey. Why don't you go through it?
Yeah. So what happened when, this discovery of Sanskrit as an Indo-European language was a theory which is posited after certain similarities were found which were just too much to ignore. So it was basically early German linguists and what they called themselves Indologists who developed this, who it struck them that there is a similarity. So they developed this theory. The first one was a person called Friedrich Schlegel. He was a linguist, a German Indologist and linguist, and he was an early Sanskrit adopter. So he learned Sanskrit. Then he found out the similarities. Then he was doing this. Okay, this was the late 19th century. He was doing all this. There was a person called Schliemann. He was a German businessman, very rich. And he was a crackpot, because he believed that Homer's stories were true and that Troy existed. So he had a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of resources, and he was basically a crackpot. But a crackpot who proved himself. He spent a lot of time and money, and he actually finally found the city of Troy in Turkey. So in this place, which was called Hesarlik, the Hesarlik Mound, he found the city of Troy. In that city of Troy, he found a lot of those symbols which we know as the swastik. He found actually 1800 examples of the swastik. And there was yet another gentleman around the same period who was called Emil Louis Barnouf. Emil Louis Barnouf was studying the Rig Veda. He was studying the Rig Veda. This Schlegel was studying the Rig Veda because of Sanskrit. And he came into contact with the same ideas in the Rig Veda, because a lot of imagery and description was something that the swastik could be related to. And of course in India there were lots of representations of the swastik. So then he put it all together. For this we also have to understand that the German Indologists, led by Schlegel and a few others, in the 19th and 18th centuries and 20th centuries were deeply, deeply racist. They had no qualms in being at all racist. So they immediately saw, look, here are the Greeks. The Greeks are using the swastik symbol. This is this land of India, Sanskrit, which is like Latin and which was brought in by conquerors. It is also using swastik. So these Aryans, they misrepresented and misunderstood the word Aryan intentionally. These must have been a race of world conquering people. And then the swastik was found across the world, whether it be Latin America or Africa or India or Greece. Swastiks have been found everywhere. It is indeed an ancient symbol of swasti. Swasti means what? Well-being, prosperity. And its actual shape refers to infinity and the infinity of the cosmos. So you can have a left-handed swastik or a right-handed swastik, and if you kind of move it around, turn it around, it refers to infinity. So it has a lot of positive meanings. But our friends decided to appropriate it for themselves. Germany was looking for, symbols to show the superiority of German people. So it was, in fact, I think almost inevitable and obvious that this very, very strong, old, ancient, powerful, widespread symbol would be adopted by Hitler because he was a smart fellow. He knew the power of imagery and he knew the power of symbols. About the Hindus themselves, there are a few very rare pronouncements of Hitler, and they are all extremely derogatory. Because his idea was that there is a master Aryan race. That master Aryan race was represented by the Greeks. It was represented by so many others, depending on wherever the swastik was found. This master Aryan race came to India, then mixed with the natives and became absolutely degraded. So the degraded people, the Hindus, we don't want anything to do with them. We only want the pure Aryans. So therefore, when Hitler was looking for a symbol for his party, he is said to have designed it himself. There is a red background.
Yeah.
There is a red background and there is a black swastik on white. At the time, what was the time? Also when communism was very much in strength across the world. So communism had the hammer and the sickle. So he needed something equally potent, something with equally, maybe an emotional response or a visceral response. So he adopted the swastik, and he adopted, I would say, encouraged German Indologists to become more and more racist. And this whole, accepting the Aryan Invasion Theory and those horse-led chariots came and they conquered everyone. All that was given wings by German Indology. For this, I will strongly recommend a book called The Nay Science by Vish Vadluri and Joy Bagchi. Please read it. If you don't read the whole thing, at least read the introduction and the conclusion. It will give you such a wonderful idea. Not wonderful, sorry, that's the wrong word to use. It will give you an idea of the terrible tragedy that unfolded when this old, beautiful, auspicious symbol was appropriated for one of the most vile acts of violence and genocide ever done by anyone.
Yeah.
As a Hindu, I feel sad about it every day. We try very hard as Hindus to remove the swastik from the connotations of the Nazis. But in Europe, in India, it's okay. Nobody cares about the Nazis anyway. But in Europe, it's extremely difficult. So I have a lot of swastik jewelry. I don't wear it here in Switzerland. And in Diwali, I normally like to make a swastik outside my house. So I am always very worried. If I make a swastik outside my house, will there be people who come and, kind of break it down?
And I think even on social media and everything, right? I think it's a very sensitive image, right? They might think you are neo-Nazi or something and take you down if you have it.
Unfortunately, neo-Nazis have picked it up again. And I really feel like shedding tears. Because the swastik is our symbol of swasti, of infinity, of auspiciousness. It was appropriated by one of the biggest villains of the 20th century or even of, of thousands of years. And then it's been still misunderstood, even today, as we speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that is the sad story of the way it was appropriated. And remember, what is the common factor between Aryan invasion theory, linguistic theories, theories which misunderstand Sanskrit? It's racism. Let's not forget that racism, colonialism, and a particular kind of superior politics was something which made all these theories prosper. Now, I think we are getting to one up, but there's something which I must say about the horses and chariots.
Yes.
So, the earlier theorists were very fond of saying that Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, IVC, can never be equated with the Vedic civilization because of an absence of horses. Because you don't find the imagery of horses or any remains of horses in the Harappan civilizational remains, whereas horses are everywhere.
In the epics
corpus
as well.
Yeah, in the Vedic corpus, they're everywhere. So obviously these are two different things. A few points. There were many animals during the Harappan age which are not found on any of the seals. Does not mean that those animals did not exist. Evidence of absence is not absence of evidence, or rather the other way around. Absence of evidence is not
I know what you mean.
Absence.
Yeah.
That is point number one. Point number two. It is also true that certain remains of horses have been found, but these are ancient genetic relatives of what we know as horses today. So there is a lot of controversy on whether these are horses or these are not. But before he died, the foremost expert on ancient horses had given his verdict in favor of those remains being the remains of ancient genetic relatives of horses. This is point number two. And again, the more the discoveries we make, the more the sites that we look at for the Saraswati Sindhu civilization, there are figurines, there are little toys of horses coming up. So to say that there was no representation is not correct. The representation was low. Chariots. So before 1500, before they thundered down, the Aryans thundered down the plains, there were no chariots in India, right? So therefore, all these have to be post-Aryan invasion, whether it be your Rigved, whether it be the Mahabharata, it has to be post the Aryan invasion because they brought the chariots. So 2 years ago, at Senoli in Uttar Pradesh, Dr. Sanjay Manjul made a once in centuries discovery of actual real chariot remains. And we flashed those pictures. They are dated to around 2500 BCE. So that is what? Much before 1500 BC.
They precede Ben-Hur also, I'm assuming. That's the most famous chariot out there.
So, we'll see pictures of it, I hope. This has been one of the biggest blows that the Aryan invasion theory has received. And so shocked are they that even without waiting to see the remains for themselves, very important archaeologists like Asko Parpola, he read a newspaper version of the events and he has written papers based on the newspaper version of events without bothering to see the actual remains to conduct a study. Such is the shock in the circles of the Aryan invasionists. Because this is a kind of earth-shaking thing. And I was privileged enough to actually go to Dr. Sanjay Manjul's office after this discovery was made, and I have seen all those remains for myself. I think you'll get goosebumps when you see it. So you can see chariots, you can see marks of a dhanush. So what you are immediately reminded of is the Mahabharata. And the timeline, well, the timeline of the Mahabharata is a very controversial subject which maybe we can go into sometime. But the burials with warriors, their spears, their hilts, sword hilts, and there are also burials of women with weapons. So in terms of horse-driven chariots, remains of which have been found, and these are much further in technology than chariots which we have seen of around the same time in Mesopotamia, because these are wheels with spokes. And spoked wheeled chariots were able to move much faster. Solid wheels, they were not able to move that fast.
Yeah.
So this is an earth-shaking discovery, and we must thank Dr. Sanjay Manjul and his team for this. I would encourage everyone to look for resources on the internet. There are many, and learn about these. So this horse and chariot is the horse and chariot which will run down the Aryan invasion theory completely. In the next 4 years, I would say, Utkarsh, we are going to get 4 or 5 years maybe, we are going to get a deluge of evidence which will make all the points that we are debating now moot. And people like Dr. Neeraj Rai, Dr. Sanjay Manjul will be leading the charge.
You know, what strikes me as fascinating is, number one, my and my peer group's absolute lack of awareness of any of this, right? So, I mean, it's kind of curious that everybody's heard of the Aryan Invasion Theory. It's kind of sitting there. I don't even remember whether it was taught to us in the school or it's just something it's there.
It is taught to you in school. It is.
It is taught
in
to
so many
yeah,
words.
Why would I
and
know
you know,
about it?
it's still not removed. And in each and every discipline, in each and every thing that is explained, the Aryan invasion theory is used. For example, in women's studies, gender studies, you have the Marxists using the Aryan invasion theory as one of the big explanations for so many things. So what can you say about historiography, which uses an event which did not happen to explain all of history?
Yeah. No, and again, and the other part of it is that all the evidence that you have shared with me, this is not, it's not an opinion, right? This is hard evidence, this is genetic evidence, this is physical remains, there's carbon dating, and I'm assuming everything. So
yes,
yeah, I
none
think
of it is opinion.
It's due time.
None of it is opinion.
Yeah.
One thing which I did tell you was opinion, and I pointed it out, is the difference between the time that the Rig Veda was composed and the Vedang Jyotish. Yeah, that was an opinion, and I mean, that is not germane to the issue at all. Even if we change it, nothing changes.
Yeah, absolutely. Great. So I think we can, this was good, right? Again, every time we have a conversation, I learn so much, and it just like with the caste system podcast, now my brain is just full of thoughts. It's just full of like, oh my God. And I think even the chariot story, even for me, because I am very, very fond of quote unquote Indian mythology. I'm going to use the word mythology with quotes for now. But
Utkarsh,
just imagining
please use the word itihas and Puran.
Yes.
Because mythology comes from the word myth, which comes from the Sanskrit word mithya, which means lies.
Is that right?
That's right.
Okay,
so don't use the word mythology. In our own epistemological system, which I mentioned, the Chaturdash Vidyasthanam, we have a name. The Itihas and the Puran. So Itihas is Mahabharata and Ramayana, and Purans are the 18 Mahapurans and the Uppurans. And most of our stories come from them.
Absolutely. Good. So thank you so much. I think this was really fun for me. I hope for the listeners as well, this was fun. Please do shoot any questions, any violent disagreements, any differences in opinion, or just anything in particular that interested you, right? We do read all the comments. We do try to respond to all of them as far as possible. And of course, we are going to be here on... Yeah,
and in fact, Utkarsh, once we have a critical mass of questions, we'll devote one podcast to the questions themselves.
Yes. We'll do an FAQ episode just to cover once we have a mass.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone.
Namaskar. See you again.
Namaste. See you.